All right, we're time to start. So without any further ado, here's Espen Bago. Tell us why agility is the #1 criteria for identity.
Thanks. Really glad to be able to be here. Let me start by telling you what this presentation is not. It's intended not to be a buzzword bingo, even if I use the word agility. So I'm prepared to explain the words that I use inside of here. And it's not a deep dive into how to build agility or exactly what we are doing, because there's no time for that. But it is based on actual and current experience. And it should be a bit closer to the... Is the clicker, does it need to be on as well? Can you see if this works? I was just going to say this is also part of my tool set to explaining to vendors why agility needs to be there in the products that we choose. But I can click on this one in the meantime. But if you can get it to work then. I don't think it's in the presentation mode, is it? Yeah. So if I click this one. Yeah, I can go back. Yeah, that works. I have to point there. Yeah. So when I say identity, I mean any access and identity product or any control system, really. And let me lead with this. To the left, there's a map of France from early 1789. And to the left, we have a list of 215 requirements for an identity product. It's the type that Bertrand was talking about as well, an IGA system. Identity, governance, and administration. And here's a close-up of another one. This is the last one I was involved in making. And we had all these categories as well. Matches some of what the analyst companies use. So we thought this looked really good, and we had the weighting and the scoring, and we had the steering committee also think it looked really good. So I just wondered, how many of you have been involved in any kind of RFP? That's a lot of you, yeah. So the arguments for using this method is it looks good, it looks scientific, and the steering committee will think you've done a good job. The arguments against it is it only looks good, and it only looks scientific. And you will not have done a good job because this method will not show you what you want to find. So to support that, if I believe some of the findings that I heard last month, 77% of IGA customers are dissatisfied with the choice. And I think most of them use this method. So they didn't find the thing that made the deal or broke the deal, because that only happens later. So we need to get to that later, sooner. So don't do that. I won't. I will never do this again. But what can we do instead then? So regardless of what you try to evaluate, make sure that you take a look at the world around you, and things changes fast in the world around you. At least in my organization, we'll get to that, but I think that's true for most of you and will be more and more true. But all of these categories is still too much to evaluate in that way. So what we are doing at the moment and testing out is to choose some examples, right? Boiling it down to what matters to us. I'll get back to this as well. But based on what we've seen so far, let's set up the agenda for this talk so you have some structure on it, right? So we need to talk about why, to see if we can agree on that. And if we agree on why it is important, then let's see if we can explain it to people. What do we mean by agility? When I say people here, very often it will be the vendors that we're trying to get something from. As a side note, that's the situation I'm in now, kind of what Bertrand was talking about. We need to switch out the current IAM stack with something new. And I'll talk a little bit at the end, if we still agree at that point, about, well, how can we do that then? But first, since I haven't done that yet, I should try to say, who am I to stand here and lecture you about agility? So I am Espen Bago. I am a program owner of identity and access at a government agency called, well, in English it's called Norwegian Labor and Welfare Administration. Thankfully in Norwegian we only call it NAV, so I'll call it NAV later. There are other sides to me as well. apart from this, and one is the ID Pro, which I want to point to. So I'm a founding member as well, and on the Body and Knowledge Committee. I have just briefly working in the certification committee, but I wanted to point that out here just to make sure that you know there's a certification at ID Pro. I recommend that, and I recommend ID Pro as like an organization to get involved with it. Another side to me is the running. I like to run maybe a bit more than most, and I like to run in the mountains if I can. I wake up in the morning here and I look over to the mountains over there and I realize I can't get there just by starting to run, right? But in the weekend. So let's just get into what kind of organization NAV is at the moment. So by the way, I said I am an identity and access program owner, which means I manage risk and I put in place control mechanisms to manage that risk, right? So there's been a development over last, let's have it 7 years. Maybe you won't see the same development everywhere, but the in-housing of ownership, that instead of hiring consultants to do the job, because there's a lot of development at applications and service even before that point. So NAV has about 25,000 employees spread across the country, serving all the many 5.5 million citizens of Norway. So a small company, a small country. But still, I think it's relatable. I'm one of the 1,000 that works centrally, of which these are part as well. So it means that it's a very developer-focused organization now that it wasn't before. And this has led to, and that was intentional, change like this is the number of production deployments per week, which went from 4 deployments a year, 4 releases a year, to around 1,200 on average per week deployments to production. And this is fast-paced development, right? This is an approach. This is the mindset. This is the organization changing into this. If you remember what's called Conway's Law, saying that organizations create the type of systems that mirror the organization that they are part of. This organization is trying to change into something that will create agile systems. The blue arrow down there, that's when I started, and that's when responsibility for access and identity was moved from IT over to security outside. And you remember what I do. I create control mechanisms. And what are the tools I currently have at my disposal for that? If you look at some research here, saying that traditional tools are not suited for a fast-paced development approach. I can relate to that. I relate to this every day when I try to choose something to kind of force the hundreds of development teams to use, because they're creating the new access rights, right? And what about this one from the same research paper? So, hi, I'm Mr. Formal IAM team, and I'm a barrier to innovation. And I don't want to be, but if all my tools are traditional IAM tools, as they call them, I might not have a choice. So I would say that any identity and access component that seeks to direct the flow of something in a desired manner is like a rock that we place in a stream. And typically, the stream will find its way around, like you were saying, Vlad, the question. And we can have better rocks than this, of course. We can have water mills, and we can maybe have dams that produce electricity. But still, they need to be able to change. And this picture here, I think it's 15 years ago I saw this one first as illustrating access control. But very often it's used in presentation to argue for more and stricter controls. And what happens if you get more control and stricter controls just to stop that flow? Sometimes the stream just flowing around it isn't the worst case scenario. This is a system of governance and administration that was built around 16th and 17th centuries, called the old regime, or it would be the ancien regime. It was part of a much larger system of checks and balances at toll gates. What this illustrates, it's called carte de gabelle. The gabelle was the tax on salt, which was very different in all the different regions, so you had to comply with that. This system had its finger on the pulse of everything, but it was not able to change, even when it really had to. So it was part of this as well. That's the map of the law and courts, a different division, and you have the different governments that were also part of this, and the church had its own divisions in addition to this. I just lost the monitor, so all around this old system, forces were building up, it's just flickering a bit, and demanding more freedom. And I think you know what happened afterwards. Another system of control, by the way, is, if you remember the quote, what is the matrix? The matrix is control. So any control system needs to be approximately as agile as the system or environment it aims to control, or else it will fail. I think there's a law there somewhere, maybe phrased a bit more elegantly. By the way, later the same year, all of those maps, or most of those maps, looked like this. Oversimplification into a 9x9 grid, just adjusted on the left side for rivers and natural features. And that's still mainly the map of France's departments today, I think. But we can't oversimplify or just choose no control if a risk assessment tells us that there's something missing. So if I'm using the IGA as an example, again, the Identity Governance Administration type of tools, but it could be any kind of access tool that seeks to direct the flow of something, registration of new customers, or login, or all the ceremonies that we have for that. I can't choose no controls, but I would almost rather choose that over traditional slow and dumb tools. Like an example of a slow and dumb IGA is the one that was mentioned in the last talk. The Oracle Identity Manager is one I work with a lot. Every change you needed to make in that one, you had to make that 3 different places just in one environment and make sure you got it right. And that makes for maybe 2 releases a year, not 1,000 changes a week. So we focused on this in our dialogue with the vendors, saying that we need agile. And what does agile mean for us? It needs to mean something that they can relate to. So we choose this concept of CI/CD because DevOps is more of a mindset kind of. You need the tools, something you can break down into components. So this is our suggestion on that. But again, with dialogue with the vendors. By the way, now we moved over to the agility what part of the presentation. So if you ask the vendors what makes identity component agile, they will tell you how they make their own product, not what it's like for me to own it. I'm not going to go into a deep dive of what this means, of course, but problem is that none of this is authoritative and has standards either, so we need to point to some examples. So when we say this, because we know that our developers can relate to it, and well, I can relate to it even if it's been 20 years since my last development day. In more detail, it means things like this. And this is what I want as a program owner for identity as well. I want APIs for configuration change, not only for calling an approval decision or getting some data out. I want automated ways of moving things from environment to environment. I want all of this and more, but none of the current vendors are supplying all of that. So that's what the talk here is about today. It's about more of us saying that we want this and we need this because we want to keep our heads. So we want CI/CD capabilities as a standard. And the question then is, how realistic is that? Is that something that I've only dreamed up? But when I first proposed this talk, or started to think about a year ago, I had not seen many traces of this at presentations, but over the last year, there's been more and more examples of people building this. So let's take a look at the Exhibit A. It's a Swiss company called Holcim that has an IGA system that they integrated with GitHub and Jenkins to do exactly that, to create some of the CI/CD pipelines for automation of changes. I have a video. These are screenshots from their video, which I can play at the end if there's time. If not, it's behind that paywall and the link down there. So they are doing that. They are building this. They have a team of developers that can build this. And if we take a look at what Salesforce has, Salesforce is not an identity product, though, something that we use at NAV. And the developers that do configuration change, they use the metadata API of Salesforce to implement some of these CI/CD capabilities. So things are getting there, and this is also one of the examples I point to vendors to say, I want you to show me some of this in your product or on your roadmap. So lastly, for the how section then, what kind of scenarios could be used or could be well chosen for that kind of evaluation? So when I said we need to boil it down to what matters, I'm going to say a little bit about the approach that we are currently trying out when we are getting input on what to choose for an identity product or an IGA product specifically. You need to get the stakeholders to accept the premise because you're going to base all of the rest on that. But I think this might be the easiest step because having agility resonates with a lot of people, also even higher up, right? Not because of the buzzword, I hope, but because you can explain it. Step 2. So and this is the most work-intense part of it. You need to identify which of the situations that you're going to use your tool in, and that's a lot of situations, do you think needs to get adjusted and readjusted again and again and again so that you want to be able to do 100 iterations of change during a month, for example, and try to, could be some of these, for example, certification campaigns, right? Something that you need to send out to a small group of people and then get feedback, say, how does this look? And it needs to be configurable again and again, because flexibility, when you ask the vendors about that, that just means flexibility for the first setup. But you're going to own this for a long time. And step 2B that we had to implement along the way was because the vendors didn't have much of that, it was not really comparable. You might, at the moment, need to ask the vendors to say, okay, which 2 situations do you think best illustrates your capabilities? So, a little bit of give and take here. And step 3, you probably have to explain to them again, what is agility? What do you mean by it? Because honestly, most of the times we sent these questions to the vendors, to the sales and pre-sales people, we got blank stares in return. So there will be some iterations of this as well. And step 4 then, repeat 2 and 2B and hope for the best. And then when you get responses, try to have time to examine that in detail and probably in a live or semi-live environment in a workshop. And then choose the vendor that you trust most to be on this trajectory, right? But we're not quite there yet. That's kind of why I'm holding this presentation, to get help to say to the vendors that we have this demand. But we are considering choosing maybe a couple of vendors and have 1 year-long trial period afterwards just to see, can this evolve in the direction? I mean, it needs to take time. And I have a request for those analysts that help us to do all of this evaluation of the hundreds of items all the time, because there's something missing here. And this is from the same vendor that I used the quotes from before, of course. If the left hand is saying the tools are not matching the need, why is the right hand still doing this long comparison that has no mention of agility? So again, this is also why I'm holding this presentation, because now I can take this back to Gartner and to the vendors and say, hey, people at conferences, even identifiers, are talking about this. So this is kind of my motivation here. In summary, and this is what I think is a law of security, the system of control should approach the agility of the environment it aims to control. It's a bit long, though, so if someone can help me shorten it, I think that would be good. And it's not just a theoretical exercise. We see people doing it. I even see some of the vendors doing it and having a focus on APIs, at least for everything new they're building. And it should be built in and standard. We've seen that it's possible to build it, But if we all build our own different version of it, or we just take the tools that the vendors give us, I don't want everyone to build their own. I want standards. And it's hard for me to take developers out of this organization I pointed to before and ask them to develop this. So I'd rather pay for it instead. So I'm willing to be here on tape saying I'll pay for it. So the question is then, can we demonstrate enough demand for it for the supply to come? Hopefully. So if you have vendors, this is my plea to you, if you have vendors in your life, tell them that you want this. We want this because we need it. And that's it.
Thank you, Espen. That was great. We have time for a few questions. Anybody have one? Anybody? Anybody but Vlad? Too late, Mike. I have to give it to Vlad, but I'll be back.
Thank you very much. It's first of all, it's refreshing to see people thinking the same way I think in terms of use cases and scenarios versus the stupid forms, which every pre-sales sales organization feels like, yes. It doesn't matter what the question is. Yes, we can do that, right? The second thing is what I would like to ask you, and actually my own experience was that. In addition to first,
it's okay if I play the video in the meantime.
Yes, in addition to see how the scenarios are turned from the standpoint of view, right? To me, it's very important how easy it is to change the situation. What I like to do, I like to create the scenarios and then throw a little wrench in it. Like when they present, they say, oh, by the way, we were talking about 4 elements coming from HR. Now it's 5. How long does it take to change it? And how you can do it. I mean, you don't need to do it in front of me, but just tell me how it can be done. Because a lot of vendors do not open up what is on the back end. They don't tell you what's going on, right? But when you ask a question like that, it helps you.
Yeah.
And the third thing is a question for you. It is very hard to sell this to management. What is your approach? Because management thinks of that as a waste of time, especially say like, 5, what do you want to do? 1 year of tryout? Give me a break. How you sell it to your own management?
So how did I sell it? Yeah, I mean, you're specifically asking about the 1 year of tryout, right? It's the most important part of that is pointing to all the other situations where it has failed within that year, because there's many examples of that. And it's a bit easier at this organization because that attempt had been made to switch out the IGA program 3 times before. So I have some leeway in saying that, okay, because they ask me, well, why do you think you can do it better this time? I'm saying, because I want to have time to try it out properly in an agile way so we can experiment. So, I mean, my situation might be a bit different. I'm not saying you have to do that to have the tryouts, but maybe you should try to have that conversation. So it's easier if you can point to all the ways that it has failed. And there's many examples of that. Short answer, I guess.
I don't need a microphone, I can yell.
Sure you want to say
When you're enjoying the long walk on the beach with your vendor as you drink Mai Tais, whatever, can you give an example? You talked about outlining use cases where configuration changes are made often. Do you personally have a pet example that you could share that if a vendor or someone said, can you give me an example from your organization, and feel free to abstract it if you need to, can you give an example that you like to use with people when you explain this?
The scenarios
Yeah.
we would choose? Yeah, so my pet example would probably be, because this is a developer-focused organization, we have hundreds of teams that own the changes that they make in the applications, okay? Which means that they're the ones causing the new access rights to suddenly appear, which means that it doesn't scale for us to have that done in a manual way, like not CSV files or schema or whatever, but as a Jira ticket or whatever to the central IJ admin. So the point is self-service for the teams to have them own only their accesses, even the accesses that haven't been built yet. it's hard to just explain that in a, but that's the most interesting example for me, if that answers your question, because that will really show value also to everyone else that sees what we do as really old-fashioned as waterfall. Well, they're right to, but.
Time for one more if anybody has a question. All right. Thank you all very much for coming. We have another
problem.
session starting in a few minutes.